Thanks. So welcome to this final plenary session. Thank you very much for staying. You are the hardcore of the Belvedere Forum. We've got just under an hour for this last plenary before we have some closing remarks. And what we're going to try to do is try to sort of join the dots a little bit between some of the things we've discussed over the last 24 hours. The strategic issues, obviously focusing on Ukraine, that we began with yesterday, but also for those of you that were there for the panel this morning on youth activism, which was really interesting. I'm going to try and join the dots a little bit between all of these different things. It was very striking, I thought, in the youth panel, the contrast, I think, between the Polish participants and the British participants in terms of I suppose, the values and the ideas that they were talking about. And I think the other thing we want to do is slightly sort of enlarge the frame here. And I mean that sort of in terms of time. So we kind of want to look a little bit into the future, perhaps beyond the war in Ukraine, but also in terms of space. So to think a bit more globally. We've obviously been focused very much, for obvious reasons, on Europe. But hopefully in this session, we can look a little bit more globally at the same time. And the way that we thought we'd do that is to think about the Polish-UK relationship, but in terms of the broader context of the West. Feels to me that in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of talk about the West, initially a lot of anxiety about the West, particularly during the Trump administration. It feels to me that since Biden became US president, there's been a sense of a sort of return of the West, which I think since the war in Ukraine began has kind of gone to another level, this sort of idea that the West is back. But I have this feeling that we kind of mean often slightly different things when we talk about the West, and we're not entirely clear what we mean by that concept. Seems to me that it can mean at least 5 different things. There's obviously the geographic concept of the West, which is basically Europe and the United States. There is also, I think, a sort of developmental or technological idea of the West, which is the sort of advanced economies of the world, embodied by the OECD group of advanced economies. Then you've got what I guess you could call a strategic idea of the West, which is obviously NATO and perhaps more broadly the US alliance system beyond the North Atlantic area. Then I think you've got a sort of normative idea of the West, which has something to do with, a set of values going back to the Atlantic revolutions in the 18th century, the Enlightenment. And then finally and fifthly, I think there's a kind of civilizational idea of the West, which is something to do with Christian or Judeo-Christian values. And all of these different concepts of the West sort of overlap to a large extent, but I think they are distinct. And in particular, which countries are included in the West is different in each of these different versions, I think. And that, I think, becomes quite important too. So what I'd love to start by asking each of our 4 panelists, and we'll see where this goes, is basically 2 things. First of all, what is your understanding of the West, to try to tease out whether we do actually all have the same idea of what the West is? And secondly, is it a useful concept in the 21st century? Let's start with you, Charles.
Right. Well, I don't see the civilizational West as quite the right West hands. I mean, I heard Putin say long ago at a Valdai Club meeting, we represent the true West in Russia. We believe in Judeo-Christian civilization. You in Western Europe are perverting it with your homosexuality, allowing too much interracial marriage. He didn't actually say that, but he implied that. Too much scope for Islam, and we are the true defenders of the West, we Russians. So I don't take his definition. I would say the West is something to do with the rule of law. I wouldn't say democracy as a whole, because some countries I would like Singapore and Vietnam, I'd like to line up with the West. But I do think it means rule of law to some degree. I think the reality, Hans, is that we're now facing a new Cold War between China and Russia on the one hand, and the Western allies, however you define them, on the other hand. And what has crystallized this war is actually the Ukraine conflict. It's been brewing for about 20 years. For the last 20 years, the West has had a bad set of narratives. There was the Iraq war, the financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, refugee crises in Europe and North America, the arrival of Donald Trump, who didn't seem to believe in the kind of democratic values that we did, our rather inadequate response to COVID. Well, China has been a great economic success. It's built up some soft power with its Belt and Road Initiative. It doesn't pry into other countries' human rights. A lot of other governments see the Chinese model of development as a very good model. And so we're on the defensive, I think. So what do we do to make things better? Just a couple of brief thoughts, and I'll stop. I think the US needs to, the most important thing to improve the soft power and moral strength of the West is for the US to sort out its own domestic problems. And Leslie may want to say something about that in a moment. But I think so long as you have the leading Western power not behaving in a way that we think a democracy should behave like, then there are question marks about the future of the West. And if 40% of Americans believe that Donald Trump won the last election, that's quite worrying to me. Secondly, I think don't ignore the UK. We're a much less important part of the West than the US, but the disconnection for Europe has not helped the West. It makes us weaker, and that's why Putin supported Brexit. Now, Brexit's not going to be overturned in our lifetime, or my lifetime, certainly. I regret that, but it's the fact. But there's no reason why we shouldn't make the UK much closer to the West, other Western powers, with the new UK government, plug ourselves into European security policy cooperation, foreign and defence policy cooperation. That, I think, probably will happen with the future British government and should happen so that we show solidarity with our Western partners. Thirdly, we need to take Asia much more seriously. I think NATO may well become an Asian security organisation. It was interesting at the last summit that Australia, New Zealand, South Korea and Japan turned up. If I'm right that we face a new Cold War with China as the leading opponent, then NATO has to become an Asian security organisation or something very similar to NATO. And I think it's not just security, it's also economics. I think the US needs to recover its liking for free trade in Asia and actually offer open its markets to Asian countries instead of boycotting the TPP, the CPTPP, and coming up with an inadequate substitute called IPEF. It needs to actually start opening up its markets in Asia. And the Europeans need to take Asia much more seriously than they have done. I don't think we can play a major role in European security, but we can play a bigger role in European diplomacy. And finally, I think we have to not forget that there's that boring thing of international organizations. The UN Security Council doesn't represent non-Western powers adequately at all. And so if we in the West want countries like Brazil, India, South Africa to line up with us in this new Cold War against Russia and China, then we have to take their concerns much more seriously and give them a much bigger place in the... Why does the IMF have to be run by a European? That's ridiculous, outmoded colonial concept. So let's open up the international organizations to non-Western countries so they play a bigger role and take their concerns more seriously. And I think that the swing countries I've already mentioned, is India a Western country? Can it become more Western? That's a big question. But what about Turkey? I think we have to try much harder to win over these countries to our side in what is, I fear, going to be a new Cold War.
Brilliant. So there's loads there which the other panelists will no doubt respond to. In particular, very interesting distinction between democracy and the rule of law. Thank you for also bringing out the sort of internal and external threats to the West, which I'm sure we'll come back to. And then NATO, I'm sure we'll get into as well, and the China challenge and so on. But Marek, give us your sense. Is your sense of the West different to what Charles has said, or is it roughly the same?
So first of all, because I knew you made a question before, so I think that this question or questions you posed at the beginning, they reflect a kind of the feelings which are very strong in Europe and in the United States, that we have lost the understanding what the West is and what the West should be. Against this backdrop, I think it is interesting to ask ourselves, if we are talking about the Polish perspective, what is the Polish perspective of the understanding of the West? And of course, this understanding is rooted deeply in the history of the 20th century, and we still, I think, in Poland try to reconstruct our understanding of the current West through the prism of these experiences, which is at the first time, on the one hand, it is of course all what is enshrined in the Atlantic Charter from 1941, and I think if we look now at these 8 points of the Charter, I think many of these points are very interesting, especially in the context of what we now experiencing, because this is about that the West means that we will not accept the territorial conquest as the goal of the war, for example, that we will try to do our best to limit the violence in the international politics, that we accept that the nations are the main actors of the politics, and that they have right to to establish their own states and their own governments, that they should cooperate, not wage wars. And I think that this is worth to recall all of this. And this is what many people in Poland, I think, especially now, recall, and what resembles very much these main principles of this Atlantic Charta 1941. 41 was interesting moment because this was the moment in which it seemed that Hitler managed to conquer all continental Europe and establish his vision of a new Europe, new order in Europe. And that was the moment in which the West decided to take Soviet Russia as an ally. And this is the second, I think, angle. Many Poland's try to understand still what the West is. And this second angle is the experience of what anti-communism is. And this is responsible what has happened during the Second War, and the fact that the West had to accept Soviets as a partners, determined very much the Polish experience and the Polish way of understanding that the West is always ambivalent, that the West is always problematic, and that our position and our way of understanding what the West should be faced always certain obstacles of the real politics. So the second component, I think, which has to be mentioned here is anti-communist. And this is the last point. But how to understand all of this in the current context? Yes. I was encouraged to oppose, to show the differences among us. So I don't like this whole talk about the new Cold War. I think this is misleading. To use this matrix of the Cold War to describe, of course I understand the reasons, because it enables us to understand something, what is happening, but it is misleading because I think it is something new, because Putin Russia is not the Soviet Union. China is not the Soviet Union. This is, to my understanding, we can try to explain it later in the discussion, rather a new kind of conflict. We have to first learn to identify. Biden tried to change the language during the Warsaw speech from the main line of division between liberal and illiberal, which was fundamental for the last years, and especially for the internal, let's say, conflict within the West, to tackle the problem of populism mainly, in my opinion, to the new kind of the division, democracies and authoritarian regimes, or I would rather use much more willingly the term despotism, new kind of despotism, as it is described by John Keane, for example. We face new kind of despotism, and we have to answer to that, because this despotism identified itself basically as anti-West. So maybe we don't know anymore what the West is, but they know very well what we are and what they want to destroy in us.
Okay, so I want to get Leslie's American response on the Cold War question in particular, but I do just want to quickly come back to this, because I think this is very interesting, that neither of you did put democracy at the center of your understanding of the West. In fact, Charles specifically said it shouldn't be. But then that brings me, Marek, to, because Charles talked about Putin's own vision of the West, right? And I guess I have to ask, I mean, to a lot of people, it looks as if the version of the West that lots of far-right parties in Europe has is actually quite similar to that version of Putin's. Do you agree with that, Marek?
No, I don't agree with that, because even if you look at the last polls made by the European Council for Foreign Affairs, they provide very interesting outcomes, because they asked also the representative from different right-wing parties in Europe what they think about Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, and there is no one common opinion, because if you look at the Italian politics, far right or as you wish to call them, I don't know, but populist parties are divided when it comes. Salvini, you know what is his option here. But if you look at May, if you look at the Italian brothers, the attitude is quite different. The attitude of Fox is in Spain very different than, for example, the attitude of Le Pen in France. Swedish Democrats, they are not so very keen to support Putin. My point is that the reason why Biden decided to change the language was not baseless, because I think that this division, illiberal, liberal, doesn't fit to the challenge we have now because of Putin, and especially because of China. And the Putin's strategy was to strengthen both sides, right-wing populist, left-wing populist, and the liberal mainstream. Because the main strategy of Russia was to mobilize the extremes to destabilize Europe and the European societies and the European political systems.
Okay. Małgorzata, what are your thoughts on this? And I don't know if perhaps you want to say something particular about the sort of strategic implications, because we have been talking about the strategic version of the West, NATO, and so on.
Thank you, first of all, for having me, for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's really useful because I guess we have a chance to really redefine this notion of the West, which is very much needed, maybe. But my point of view is let's have, certain words used when we really need them, because if we don't need them, if it's more chaos instead of understanding something more, maybe sometimes it's better to avoid it. So I think the West as a concept is exactly in this moment that we don't precisely know what it means, and it's maybe a good occasion to look at it in the new way. It's a little bit, when I hear this discussion, like discussing European project. It's like maybe, every generation have to rediscuss what it is, because we are losing sometimes really an identity here. So maybe somehow with this concept of the West, during the last 30 years, we are also in a way lost it in our own eyes, right? And who brings it to the table? Actually, Russia, because what I think is obvious to all of us is that the Russian invasion into Ukraine is just challenging the West. It's how Putin puts it. It's really against the West. So he brings it, Russians bring this concept to the table again, pushing us to redefine it. We maybe wanted to forget it even because it wasn't really clear, but now we have to bring it back. And what I think happened during the last 30 years is really a lot of changes, also within the West itself. So I think we have to really start from here. It's like discussing my country, Poland. We have even difficulty to think about what Poland is, because it's also in the middle of East, West, North, and South, and we are having a kind of this bridge position, and we could have a very good understanding. We position ourselves also as a country, for example, who understands a little bit better maybe Russia than the Western West, right? So in this regard, the West also has to think about, who is defining this concept? Because there is the Western West, meaning the UK, the US, France, Italy. This is really the West. I presume for many Western people from the West, that's the West. Then there is the West of the Eastern West, or Central Eastern West, like Poland, right? We are the West as well, and we may look at these things slightly differently. And I also think we are at the moment, after 30 years, of being very keen to, do these definitions and be very active part of the West, because we are West. But we are West for us. Are we West for you? Right? Then we have also the West of allies of the West, countries like Japan, Australia. You were writing about your concept of, you mentioned the geographic dimension. This would be also interesting to hear, what is the West for Japanese? What is the West for South Koreans? Are we considering them West? And if yes, with what way? Or if not, in what way not? And why not, right? And then finally, we have the rest, with this famous notion, the West and the rest. Now it's more maybe even the rest and the West, because the rest is dominating, right? And very much this rest is not anymore the rest, is the center maybe. We have China, we have the BRICS summit, like Brazil, like, South Africa. All these countries are, who knows, the new West. Depends how we understand the West. If we understand the West as a leadership, as a domination, as a supremacy, this is how we understand the West. We still understand the West this way, right? It's very difficult for us to say, no. We are not dominating power. But now, maybe there are newcomers. India, China, they push the West to be less West. They want to be the West, maybe, from our perspective, right? And they are East to us, completely. So it's really a big question mark in the puzzle. I think it's not easy to give you an answer. But at least we could put questions.
That's great. I think you've shown the complexity, but it also leads us, I think, perfectly onto Leslie, because you were talking, Małgorzata, about how we sort of been forced to rediscover the West because of the war in Ukraine, right? Until the war in Ukraine started, or rather until the Trump administration began, my reading in the United States, Leslie, is that the concept of the West had been in a long-term decline, since about the 70s, basically. And this is partly to do with the sense that it no longer works because it has all of this civilizational baggage in a country like the United States, civilizational baggage that makes it quite close to the concept of whiteness, actually, and that no longer works. And it's part of why Obama, when he became president, talked about the liberal international order, which was a kind of way of talking about the West without saying the West. Then, as I say, you've had Trump and the war in Ukraine. But give us a sense of how much of a future do you think the concept of the West has for the United States?
So first of all, thank you, Hans, and thank you for setting it out so well, and thank you to Robin and everybody who's made today possible. And since I haven't been here so far, I do have to say how tragic and sad I personally feel about the shooting of Shinzo Abe. It's devastating, and talk about somebody who's certainly a country and a person who's part of the West. I guess my starting point is, when Robin and I were writing our piece for our centenary project about reviving the West, during that piece and ever since, I've always tried to don't use the word the West, Leslie. And then it's just impossible. You kind of have to use it, not because you know exactly what the definition is, but precisely because you sort of don't. And it's that thing that you know and you feel, and there's really no other word to quite capture it. And I think that's important. So when I was thinking about your question that you sent us today, I thought, the question at some level is always, what's the baseline? And the baseline, I think, for determining, in my mind, who's in and who's out of the West is whether you start, when a country is assessing the intentions of another country, is the baseline starting point one of trust or deep suspicion? Do you look at the same behavior in another country and do you start from the assumption that that same behavior is intended to be malign with respect to you? To me, that, in a sense, defines, whether you assume another country is part of that West that we in the West consider ourselves to be part of, or whether it's on the outside. And that actually becomes extremely important because, of course, we know that a big source of conflict and tension in our world is because we misassess and misread the intentions of other countries. So I think that baseline of trust, which of course is grounded in some very concrete things like openness and transparency, a confidence in the democratic process, the rule of law, et cetera. So it's not sort of completely amorphous, but it is an assumption, a starting point about trust as opposed to suspicion. The second thing I kind of wanted to say, and I'm going to get to your U.S. question, is maybe I'll start with your U.S. question. The U.S., I think, I've never heard, certainly in Washington and President Biden, President Obama, and others, but as I live and spend time in the U.S., I've never heard anybody talk about the West. You don't hang out in California, Omaha, Iowa, Illinois, Idaho, Illinois, and nobody talks about the West. It's not a concept that Americans care about, talk about. It doesn't mean that they don't care about Europe, but it's not in the lexicon, so it's not about the West.
When Trump was asked about it, he thought that people were talking about San Francisco, right?
Yeah, exactly. The West is, the old movies. It's not, California's not even the West anymore. But I do think that, so the U.S. is in a deep moment, and I guess this is to your comment, Charles, of an extended moment, an incredibly significant and intense moment of trying to understand and define who we are, who is in, who is out. That is not new. It's particularly divisive, and it's manifest in every single issue and debate in the United States right now. However, the idea that the U.S. has to sort out its democracy, or that it will, before it engages beyond its borders, and God forbid that you had to wait for America to decide who we are and how we would govern our democracy, if you had to wait for that, boy, would we all be in trouble. So please don't tell America to sort out its democracy before it tries to contribute in a positive and meaningful way to stability, peace, prosperity, security, democracy beyond its borders, and hopefully in a measured way and not in an instrumental way or one that uses military force in a way that we don't desire. There will always be hypocrisy, there will always be selectivity. I like to think that it comes down to humility, transparency, recognition of deficits, but also a willingness to engage in the significance of the fact that there is this identity that can't quite be pinned down, but it's grounded in a degree of trust. I also think that the West is an incredibly useful concept because it allows us to try and figure out what it is we're talking about. And I would argue that it's far more useful concept than the Cold War. And that, I guess, comes to your point, and maybe I'll make it my final point. I do agree that the Cold War concept is, hinders more than it helps in trying to define where we are. We go back to it because the world is more complex. There are more challenges. Our relationship, the West, the relationship with China is more multifaceted. It is more complex. Wouldn't it be easy if it was the Cold War? And we could sort of put it down to that, and then we would know where we stood. The baseline, if it held, would be very helpful, but I don't think it does. And very final point on the West versus the rest, how horrible and denigrating and just awful it is to be defined as the rest, to be defined as a fence sitter, to be defined as a swing state. We know this when we go to the rest of the world. It doesn't seem relevant, it doesn't seem accurate, it makes us look small, it makes them look big, they are very big. And I guess I'll close on this, I think a lot of people inside the United States, if you said, are you part of the West or the rest, in our multicultural, demographically changing country where by 2050 whites will be a majority minority population, I think many, many people would assume that they were part of the rest, not the West.
That's great. So I want to give you all a chance to respond to each other a little bit, but I also want to take some questions, and we only have 25 minutes left, and we do have a hard stop for the reasons that were outlined earlier. So what I'm going to do is take a few questions. I'm going to throw one in myself, and then give you a chance to respond to both those and to anything else that you want to respond to that other people have said. So I do want to come back to this democracy question, partly because, Malcolm, when you made your opening remarks yesterday, you were talking about Poland's transition to becoming a Western democracy. So I'd love to tease that out a little bit more. But also, I do want to come to this Asia question, which Charles has touched on and has come up a bit already, because I guess in the war in Ukraine, often it seems to me that the term West is just a shorthand for NATO, right? And that's why it's useful in a way. You don't have to say NATO every time. Or perhaps it's the wider US alliance system, if you include Japan and other countries that have gone along with the sanctions, right? But in a sense, there's something quite misleading about the current moment because it's so focused on Russia, but we know that in the medium term, the bigger challenge is China. And there it seems to me that actually the West is actively unhelpful for reasons that have been mentioned, which is that a lot of the countries that you need as part of a sort of coalition to deal with the China challenge, and I think India is at the top of the list, I think can't be part of the West under any of the 5 definitions I've given. So I think there's something actively kind of unhelpful about framing, given the China challenge, framing things in terms of the West. And then I think we mix up the Western democracies quite a lot, which I think is also a bit unhelpful because it sends a message to countries like India that we think that we as the West can speak on behalf of democracies. Malcolm, you look like you have a two-finger about to... So anyway, I wanted to get your response to that, and then let's take a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, and actually, Malcolm, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you. What I wanted to do was to challenge Charles on his assumption that we have a new Cold War, because that implies it's something broadly similar to what we had after the Second World War. I'd suggest it's fundamentally different. The Cold War was not just a national struggle. I mean, Russia's a nation state nowadays. It doesn't have an ideology. But the Cold War was an alternative ideology of communism, and it appealed to tens of millions of people who lived in the West. In France and Italy, the main political parties, they never got power, but they were the communist parties for 20, 30 years. And in addition to that, the Soviet Union already controlled half of Europe. It was right in the middle of Germany. And so it was, in a sense, a continuation of the Second World War, unfinished business. What we've got now is very, very serious. I don't question that for a moment. But the Russian objective, essentially, is to recreate Russia as an empire. And that is essentially a European concept. To do so, it wants also to extend its power elsewhere, obviously. But it's not a global struggle in the sense that the Cold War represented. So my final point, just on this, very briefly, is that I think it's misleading and dangerous in terms of wider public opinion for the public to feel we're now back to the Cold War. It's a totally different situation. Russia starts about 1,000 miles east of where it was for 50 years after the Second World War.
That's great. So that follows up on Leslie's challenge on the Cold War question as well. It may be, though, Malcolm, that Charles was meaning the global struggle with China rather than with anyway. But you can answer. I'd love to get Polish responses on that Cold War. Is the Cold War framing right as well? But let's take a couple more. Slavomir. Go ahead, Slavomir.
Yes. So the concept of the West is problematic and has been problematic since the end of the Cold War, and that was exactly the reason why new ideas, new framework were at least proposed. We do have a community of democracies, an organization established in the end of 90s with the headquarters in Warsaw. And this organization is effectively dead. One of the reasons is that Russia is a member of, because there was another time in which this organization was established by Madeleine Albright and Bronisław Geremek, among others. So we still have organizations like this, which was supposed to somehow be a kind of the alternative to this, very exclusive concept of the unity, which the West proposed. In the Foreign Affairs article published a year ago in February 2021, Joe Biden used the Churchill's term, the free world, as a kind of another alternative for the West. Why? Because we are living in a world which is defined by the competition between autocracies, the new despoties, and the rest in the sense. So those countries who are democratic, who are fulfilling the principles of Atlantic Charter, and Churchill used this term to describe this community. So my question to the panel is, which of these two terms are actually better? The West, community of democracies, we had the summit, and or the free world?
Free world. That's great. I'm going to take one more right at the back, the woman in the back row. And I will get to everyone else in the next round. We've still got plenty of time.
Hi, my question is a bit a plea to take a step back, looking at the history of even international relations. So, for instance, the theories of Huntington, of Fukuyama,
Yes.
about these labels, about the clash of civilization. Do we need labels like the West? Even especially that it's not a synonym to any kind of regime that we have mutually shared. This is not a synonym for any organization that we are all in. And seeing so many drawbacks of these kind of labels, even when we think of, for example, as you said, Leslie, about the division between the West and the rest, about the whole Orientalism question that Said has for so long advocated. I'm thinking, do you see any sense of this kind of labeling?
That's great. Thanks for mentioning Huntington. I obviously had him in the Clash of Civilizations in mind when I was talking about the civilizational concepts of the West, not so much the West and the rest, but the West versus China and Islam, which is how Huntington frames it. And thank you also for mentioning Edward Said, because again, that was what I meant when I talked about the decline of the sort of traction of the concept of the West in America. It's, goes back to Edward Said and so on. But so anyway, broader, I guess all the questions have in common is what is the most helpful way of framing where we are in international politics right now? Is it the Cold War? Is it the free world? Is it democracies? Or as the last question implied, is this all kind of completely unhelpful? Marek, let's start with you.
Really, there are many problems raised now. So maybe I will concentrate on one, two points. Cold War. I think, of course, many elements of the current conflict are rooted in the, let's say, legacy of the Cold War, especially in the case of Putin and Russia, certainly. But my question is whether this concept of the new Cold War is fitting reality. I would rather argue that the real causes of the current situation is the character of the evolution of globalization we could observe in the last 3 decades. And I think we have to think much more about the consequence or of the failures of the concept of the interdependency than of the Cold War, because interdependency didn't work as expected. Globalization, technology, capitalism, and so on gave quite new tools in the hands of different center of powers. And some of them don't share, sorry for that, Western values. And that is why we need this label.
What are Western values? I think that's quite important.
I mean that authoritarianism is, I think it is too complex and complicated. I think despotism is the simplest way maybe to try to understand the difference. If you look at Russia and if you look at China, you see two types of despotism. One is rooted in the past. The other is rooted in future. But they are two kinds of despotism we have to face because they identified themselves as anti-West, and that made this choice not without reason. So why we should now somehow avoid this challenge, and how should we say no, we are not the West, this is a mistake, you don't understand us very well, we are something else. So please, I think we have to take this challenge seriously, and it means that we have to rethink what it means for us today, Western values we are ready to protect and to defend in the world. And if you look at India and other cases, then of course the term despotism doesn't work. So you can see a difference between adversaries and potential partners.
But what about Charles's point that Putin believes in a version of the West too?
No, there was no, as I said, there were never any Putin's concept of the West. This is rubbish. This was a pure strategy to put Europeans into the confusion by mobilizing the extremes. And for the conservatives, Putin could be very conservative. For liberals, he could be very liberal. For lefts, they could be very left. That was absolutely a cynical game only.
Okay, Charles.
To answer Malcolm, I didn't mean the Cold War in the sense of Russia against the West. I did mean China. I do think there is a political Cold War between China and its allies, including Russia and the Western, so-called Western countries. I think this is the reality now. The difference with the old Cold War, of course, is that there is an immense economic entanglement between China and Western countries, but like Germany and America, huge economic entanglement. And the question I don't know the answer to is, to what extent does the political Cold War mean a disentangling of the economic ties? I hope not, because we'll all be much poorer if they disentangle. There has been a little bit of disentangling already. America's put pressure on European allies to throw Huawei out of its 5G networks, which is happening. America has banned exports of the most sophisticated microchips to China, and China's now developing or trying to develop its own industries because it can't rely on Western suppliers. So there is some, at the level of high technology, some disentangling already. How far that goes, I don't know. I think you said, Malcolm, there's no ideology. I think there is an ideology. I think Russia and China have an anti-liberal ideology. They hate the New York Times. They hate liberalism, and that's what they stand for. So anyway, so that's enough. One other point. I think yes, we can't agree on a good definition of the West, and I agree nobody's got the best definition. But I think it's not, Biden is wrong to categorize it as democracy, because I want Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and India to line up with us against China and some of the conflicts that may happen in the future. But I do think rule of law and some conception of liberalism are part of the answer. And I do worry about India. And India is I think, perhaps the word swing state is very patronizing. I don't wish to be patronizing, but I think it is a swing state. On the one hand, India has elements of democracy, and it does line up against China. On the other hand, it lines up for Russia, and it's less democratic than it was in the way that it's becoming a Hindu nationalist country. So I think India with the quarter of the world's population is a big part of the future.
Is India's Russia policy not the same as Germany's China policy?
No, I think it's much more sympathetic to Russia than Germany's China policy. Germany's China policy is changing and becoming less sympathetic than it was. And finally, Leslie's point about America, we shouldn't wait for America to sort out its problems before we ask it to do anything. And of course, you're right, but I do think Americans, yourself included, should not ignore its domestic problems, because in terms of the narrative that China's been so successful in building a narrative, as is Putin, about the decline of the West and the hypocrisy of Western civilization. If America is run by people like Trump, then it just feeds into that narrative, and Americans have to sort out their country to strengthen the moral power and the moral suasion of the West.
Now I understand what it's like for all those other countries that we patronize. It's so patronizing, but I mean, but it's a good position to be put in. Can I add to this now that I'm being patronized? So I think we should define what we mean by swing state, because it's one of those terms. It's much worse than the West in terms of we all sort of use it. Nobody knows what they mean. I mean, Americans talk about swing states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and that's a very different definition. But I do think it's actually important, and I doubt that India sees itself as a swing state. I imagine that they think that they have interests, that they're complex, that they are pursuing their interests in a very intelligent and decisive way, that they're a very significant power, much more so than the UK on multiple dimensions. And I don't think that they're up for grabs. So, if you think that it's important to kind of also think of it from the perspective of the state under consideration, then I think the term might be useful in some cases, but I think it's really deeply problematic. I think that Sam Huntington's work on Clash of Civilizations, unfortunately, massively undersold his work as a scholar. It was deeply destructive and damaging for international debate. But putting that aside, I think that and he had some truly extraordinary work that preceded it, as we know, as you clearly know. I think that we live in a world where some of our basic assumptions are deeply contested at every level. The first one is that it's deeply contested what the best way of governing ourselves domestically in countries across the globe. That is clearly deeply contested. It's not just that democracy has been backsliding for 16 years and that only 20% of the world's people live in free countries. It's also that they don't necessarily believe that they need to or wish to. So there's deep contestation domestically. There's deep contestation over the rules-based order, whether it's good, who should be in, who should be out, what it should look like. That's probably not as new as we think it is, but it's clearly very intense. But the third thing I would say about this contested world is that it is also a world where there are two giants. If you, on any material measure, whether it's military power or economic power, and then there's a big gap even with Russia, which has been very successful as a third power. But where the two giants really do stand out, that doesn't make, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, that doesn't make it a bipolar world. It's still a multipolar world in which technology has a major impact. And so we know that the complexity of all of those things far exceeds the ability of any one state either to impose its will or to create consensus on governance arrangements. So I think we're in a really, really tough position. I'll just stop there.
Great. Małgorzata.
Well, it's obviously the answers will be different from how we start. First of all, I look at the map behind us, all the discussion is where Europe is in the center, and that's the map we are used to so much. So for us, concept of the West is very much the concept that the West is a leader, is a dominating power, is the center of soft power and hard power, and it's an efficient way of governance. And I think all this is questioned right now. And I agree with Leslie as well, that's about really, it's like a power game. So the West, in this sense, understood by Putin, is questioning the leadership, questioning the rules, questioning who is really the leader of the whole process. That's why the maps look different in China. If you look at the Chinese map, China is in the middle. That's a middle kingdom, right? Yeah. That's even, if you look at sometimes even from Australia's point of view, Australia is on the top. It's a very interesting map, to put our mind in a different way, to challenge us, that it's not only that we have to be in the middle, right? So that's one thing. Second thing is I think the answer will come with the efficiency concept, because politics is very pragmatic. It's all about pragmatism. Who is more efficient to answer the key questions of the current world? Who is better to deliver and to solve the issues which are in front of us? So, it's not particularly necessary that democracy will deliver. I don't know. Maybe not, maybe yes. We have to prove it. So we are challenged also from this side that, maybe it will turn out that the democracy concept, which is very much connected with the West, and our values, which we believe strongly, who knows if they are effective or not? We have to prove it. So it's like a call for action, right? And last point is that I think from the point of view of Russia, it's also about imperialism. It is not so much about the West, but definitely there is a concept of the third Rome. So Russia wants to continue something big even if they don't have really so much soft power. They have hard power still, soft power, yes, in a way, but it's very much a concept of empires. It's a little bit like Star Wars or Game of Thrones. And in this way, concept of democracies, we think can help because we see it as a fight between evil, and good forces, like Lord of the Rings, right? That helps us because we think, of course, we are on the right side. That's why we see democracy values as good, right? But it's not necessarily seen the same way from the other side of so-called rest. So at the end of the day, it's all about if we are able to prove that our way is more efficient. That was how Europe And the West started to dominate in the world because our way was more efficient, simply as that.
But again, not everybody in the West is a democracy, and not everybody outside of the West is not a democracy, so we have to be careful. I said that we have plenty of time, and now time has disappeared. So I'm going to take 3 very quick questions and then go to you for very quick responses. So first of all, the gentleman here. And sorry, I'm not going to be able to take all of them. I will take yours in a second.
Thank you. Adam Czerniak, Warsaw School of Economics, Political Insight. I'm an economist, so I'm listening to your discussion from an economist perspective. And this reminds me of discussion about capitalism. What is capitalism? How to define capitalism? What is not capitalism? And you have the same struggles as we economists have in that direction. So I'm thinking about, from a methodological perspective, whether wouldn't it be more interesting to look at what is not West.
Okay.
So there are 2 types. So what is and what is not. So if you could say what is not the West.
The non-West, yeah, great. And then the woman here in the middle, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I had a question regarding trust. Let's assume that there is a West and there are values like Dr. Bonikowska said. And I was just wondering whether, even if we think like this is our best view, how can we make sure that we start a dialogue that doesn't come from like a perspective of, yes, we want to include your view, but we have the best view and we're going to actually try to convince you. And because I think this also, like if we want to include other countries in institutions that are already westernized in a way, how we make sure that actually they're going to make an impact on those institutions.
Okay, great. And then the gentleman there at the back. Very quickly, if you can.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Dr. Khan. I'm a teacher and student of politics. I had a few comments to make, but now I'll shorten it just to come to my question.
One question, please.
So I believe that this concept of West, and it boils down to the question of conflict resolution and how to check our national interests. Now, what I understand that this concept of West and independent values is challenged by our national interests and the failure to resolve conflicts. Now, just the last sentence, I believe for those rest, like those who are not in the West, for them, what they see is that what are the mechanisms in place where there is a conflict, whether it's Ukraine or other conflicts. So they look, there is a General Assembly or there is Security Council. So the Western values, do they exist in General Assembly? Do we engender those values which we have dear for us in that General Assembly? That's how the rest see the West.
Great. So we've got, can you define the West negatively? Persuasion, basically, how do you persuade without proselytizing? And then national interest in the UN, and I guess that particularly might be for you, Leslie. Let's start, though, with Charles.
I'll just try and answer then what's not the West. I think if a country does not allow some political pluralism, doesn't have to be a full democracy, but some rival centres of power and authority within that country, that's not the West. I think if it puts priority for the collective over the individual and suppresses individual rights and personal freedom, that's not the West. And I think if it believes externally in spheres of influence or empire, and that believes that big countries should be able to dominate and bully the small countries close to them, it's not the West. You can say America's dominated Latin America for some of the time, but nothing's perfect. But I think that's my three-part definition of what's not the West.
Brilliant. Thank you. Leslie.
You know, I was...
Do the UN question rather than the US.
I'm going to do the West first and then the UN. I was trying to come up with countries, and every time I came to one, I suddenly thought, but there's a part of them that's part of the West. I actually found it really hard to find a country. I did descend on one group that I'm quite certain is not part of the West, and that's ISIS. But I actually had...
Wow.
Okay, but I did have a hard time, actually, when I thought, because there are a lot of countries that we might say aren't part of the West, but they have deep elements of the West within them. So it's really complex. It's interesting. On the UNGA, are there Western, are the norms that are embedded in our multilateral institutions inherently biased towards what we take to be the West? I would say yes, in most of them. However, that too is a source of very deep contestation, and there certainly are regional organizations in which there are concerted efforts to, embed illiberal, non-Western norms. But I think, on balance, there has been an effort to push transparency and any other number of values that we associate with being Western.
And I guess Mark Mazawa's work is important on this, isn't it? Małgorzata.
Well, I would just go back to how I started. Maybe I just try to reframe it. When you ask anyone from the Central European countries, the West, the definition of the West was quite simple for us years ago. It was basically values, freedom, wealth, prosperity, good governance, transparency, free movement of people, freedom of speech, all these things. Now, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have to ask ourselves if this is still the case. If this is still the case. Because in many ways, the West compromises with our own values and ways of operating. So this is why we have in the West the problem with many notions here. That's why we wanted even to avoid using the word West. In the same time, parallelly, some countries of the West thought maybe it would be good to be a new West. What does it mean? Not to shift to the West. They will stay where they are. But to take some of our characteristics, such as good governance. It does not mean necessarily democracy, but good governance, efficiency, resolving people's problems, right? Maybe wealth, prosperity, innovations, being leader in technology, innovations, whatever, right? So when you look at that, we have to question ourselves now. If we want to beat the West still, we have to deliver. We have to be as the West was. If not, if we are not able, which we will see in some years, I don't know, 50 years, 30 years, we will, because it's a transition period now, then we can be maybe a new East, and they will be a new West, who knows? Okay. If we understand the notion from this point of view.
Great. Finally, Marek, last word to you.
I think what is at the stake is to whether we are capable of restoring the norm or rules-based order. That is now at the stake. And from that point of view, I think to talk about the West has the sense. But certainly, West is not useful for transforming others to the West. That would be absurd to expect that we use the idea of the West to make all words as the West. That is not the goal. The real goal is to restore the rule-based order.
Great. So I don't think we've answered either of my two questions. You know, what is the West and is it a helpful concept? But I think we have shown the complexity in the concept of the West and that it's important to have this discussion. So maybe a little ambitious to try to squeeze it into an hour, but I think we had a really good discussion.